We are the music makers, and we are the dreamers of dreams, wandering by lone sea breakers and sitting by desolate streams, world losers and world forsakers, on whom the pale moon gleams. Yet we are the movers and shakers of the world forever, it seems. With wonderful, deathless ditties, we built up the world's great cities, and out of a fabulous story, we fashion an empire's glory. One man with a dream at pleasure shall go forth and conquer a crown, and three with a new song's measure can trample an empire down. We in the ages lying in the buried past of the earth built Nineveh with our sighing, and Babel itself with our mirth, and o'erthrew them with prophesying to the old of the new world's worth, for each age is a dream that is dying, or one that is coming to birth. Arthur O'Shaughnessy. Once in a while, a title comes along which defines its respective genre for years to come. On September 7th, 2017, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the North American release of Final Fantasy VII. 20 years ago, this game became an instant legend, and it has remained a source of fascination and adoration for those 2 decades, with only a few of those anti-culture contrarians claiming it's crappy and overrated. For the rest of us with our heads on straight and our eyes full of Mako, we know that Final Fantasy VII may not be perfect, get back you savages, but it sure is an incredible experience representing a milestone in gaming history. The immediate problem that confronts us is this. It's really intimidating to review, analyze, and in some areas even criticize a legend. When a game is as beloved as Final Fantasy VII, when it's surrounded by a sea of rumors, hoaxes, tributes, fanfics, fan art, fandoms, and fandoms, spin-offs galore, the tease of a remake, and various ships, it becomes this insurmountable mountain of a task to write on the game. How do you say something about Final Fantasy VII that hasn't already been said? What could you write about it that could possibly appeal to, or satisfy for that matter, the seething masses of religious-level fanatics that adore this game? How could you possibly criticize the nuances of its mechanics or its storytelling and survive unscathed after the inevitable internet backlash? Yet I believe that great artists and art deserve good criticism. This is a moment of transparency for us, for me at least. It's really hard to write about famous games. It's very intimidating. That's why I personally fluctuate from reviewing newer games to older games, titles that everyone has heard of, to hidden gems, classics and legends, to obscure unknowns. Maybe if you're a reviewer, you suffer from the same malady, and I wonder what you do to get around it. In any case, we couldn't exactly pass up the opportunity to review one of the most beloved games in history next to, chess and football? We couldn't miss the opportunity on its 20th anniversary either. So a massive bucket of gratitude must go to the Black Humor Mage, a founding member, for creating the germ of this content and proposing to write a review for Final Fantasy VII on September 7th, 2017 at all. Since we had to do this game justice, since we felt it couldn't just have a regular review, here's what's about to happen. Let me present to you our first ever dual cast review. That's a fanfare. Think the dual techs in Chrono Trigger. In a dual cast, 2 mages combine their respective magics to produce a piece that receives input from both writers in a kind of back and forth conversational format, emphasizing 2 different perspectives at once. I've wanted to do something like this for some time now, and this anniversary of Final Fantasy VII proved to be the perfect chance to create a dual cast. You see, in the arcane communique of our Mage Lead team, we claim in advance the games which we'd like to review. At this point in time, we're not allowing anyone the chance to review a game we've already reviewed, excepting versions, editions, and remakes. Maybe someday after we've built up a bigger selection of reviews, we can do revisits. I themed this blog around Final Fantasy, one of my favorite franchises in gaming. and I've been chipping away at reviewing bits and pieces from that sprawling series since we began. So when the Black Humor Mage announced recently that he'd just completed Final Fantasy VII for the first time and he wanted to review it, I had a sudden paradox of emotions. On the one hand, hey, that's great that he's reviewing the intimidating title and I won't have to. But on the other hand, I wanted a chance to take a shot at the legend myself. We went back and forth on the issue until the proposition of a dual cast review appealed to both of us. So voila! The following review has been a monumental task, completed by two writers, myself who grew up with this game and has played through it multiple times representing nostalgia, and the other who has played it for the first time from the vantage point of today, representing modernity. We'll be able to provide two unique perspectives on this classic from two different angles, and I hope you enjoy our conversational review. Just follow the talking heads. Without further ado, let's celebrate Final Fantasy VII. Be warned, this is spoiler talk, but really, if you haven't played this game by now, you're doing yourself a disservice. For many people, Final Fantasy VII represented their first time playing a Final Fantasy, with all of the engaging storytelling which that entails. Before 1987, the Final Fantasy franchise enjoyed a presence in gaming, and in its first 10 years it sold fairly well. Its greatest successes were safely in the Japanese market, however, and other territories like the US and Europe weren't able to enjoy every title released in the series as they were launched. Cue the confusing hullabaloo of misnamed games: Final Fantasy II versus Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy III versus Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy Adventure, and Final Fantasy Legend. North America never even received the actual Final Fantasy II and III, not until they were remastered and repackaged for future systems years later. Despite the disarray, Final Fantasy quickly built up a reputation for engaging roleplay built on customizing job classes, as well as interesting and occasionally even moving storytelling. The series became a marked influence for RPGs. Final Fantasy IV ushered in a new standard for emotional characters and drama, and Final Fantasy VI, my personal favorite, featured a world and cast that was bigger than ever. Then came Final Fantasy VII, the first main sequel game, with a consistent numerical name across the globe. For many a gamer, it was the first RPG they'd ever played. The game sold almost 2.5 million copies in just 3 days, the fastest-selling Final Fantasy game worldwide in its time. Its platform, the PlayStation, the newcomer in the hardware scene, was eventually sold on the back of Final Fantasy VII's success. 7 was an RPG that appealed to so many people who thought of the genre as belonging to the dungeon-crawling D&D high fantasy scene with its generic heroes in loincloths brandishing giant swords and dragons, not to complex sci-fi narratives with powerful themes and unique three-dimensional characters. I think the game took a lot of people by surprise, especially those who hadn't followed the series through the SNES. 7 helped to popularize RPGs and JRPGs across the world in a way no previous game had. It single-handedly made its own genre more accessible to millions.
Final Fantasy VII was released first in Japan of January 1997. The Final Fantasy series had been around for some time, and this was its first venture into a three-dimensional space. Producer Hironobu Sakaguchi and Square planned and developed Final Fantasy VII in a span of 2 years beginning in 1994. Originally, Final Fantasy VII was going to be developed for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System right after Final Fantasy VI was released. However, the workforce was reallocated to complete Chrono Trigger.
Chrono Trigger turned into a massive development task fueled by Square's dream team. The demanding project of passion ended up putting its own composer, Yasunori Mitsuda, into the hospital, and the game used a lot of concepts originally intended for Final Fantasy VII. Both Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger were highly successful projects put out by Square, but though they represented a slew of risks and experimentation taken on the part of the developers, Square knew it was time for something more. Final Fantasy VII represents a shift in the Final Fantasy franchise. It was a game of firsts and a step from 2 dimensions into 3.
Once 1995 came around, Chrono Trigger was released, and so Sakaguchi and his team saw opportunity in using computer-generated 3D graphics and tested the waters with a tech demo of Final Fantasy VI characters in a 3D battle mode. This experiment success pushed them forward to develop Final Fantasy VII in 3D. They weren't even concerned with whether or not it should be developed for the PlayStation or Nintendo 64 yet because they were too concerned with learning how to create a 3D video game.
When the time came to actually put plans to paper, though, they found that sticking with Nintendo would be impossible. Nintendo was the company whose hardware brought Final Fantasy into the world, but it was time for the series to leave that protective cradle and venture out into the great unknown. Square announced on January 12, 1996, that it would be developing Final Fantasy VII for Sony's PlayStation console. No longer would Final Fantasy appear exclusively on the NES, the SNES, and the Game Boy, excepting the MSX. As a result of using a lot of motion data and CG effects and in-still images, it turned out to be a mega capacity game, and therefore we had to choose CD-ROM as our media. In other words, we became too aggressive and got ourselves into trouble. Hironobu Sakaguchi. This came as a shock to many people who had played the Final Fantasy games leading up to 7 and expected that the sequel would appear on Nintendo's new N64. But it happened out of necessity when it was discovered that the massive 3D Final Fantasy game being developed, with its complex environments and loads of new complex character models, full motion videos, and gigantic story, clocked in at 1.32 gigs. This game saw the largest development team ever assembled for a video game up to that point in history. 120 people, including visual effects artists who worked on Jurassic Park and Terminator 2. And the game they created was equally huge, but it would occupy only a few discs on the Sony PlayStation. In comparison, should Final Fantasy VII have appeared on N64 cartridges, which could only hold 64 megabytes of data each, the game would have spanned about 22 carts without compression and could have cost up to $1,760 in retail. Nintendo, stubbornly sticking with cartridges as the industry moved on to its discs, cost them one of the crown jewels of gaming history. This may have been the beginning of the end for Nintendo's popularity, and they've slowly shifted away from center interest since then. But Final Fantasy VII marked the rise of influence and reputation of the Sony PlayStation as a platform that could feature robust RPGs like the SNES could, and also games which would appeal to a maturing audience of gamers. Since then, Final Fantasy has almost entirely appeared in the PlayStation lineup, with only a few exceptions on Nintendo and Xbox devices and PC.
The three-dimensional style of Final Fantasy VII was not the only feature that helped make PlayStation successful. The narrative plays a huge part in why this game has such a huge following. When Sakaguchi was developing this project, he originally wanted it to take place in New York City, with the main character being a detective who was investigating an eco-terrorist organization. One of the characters that was part of that organization was Cloud Strife, who soon became the protagonist of Final Fantasy VII. The story began to take form, and eventually it became the premise as follows. The Avalanche organization, led by Barrett Wallace, hires an ex-soldier mercenary named Cloud Strife to help them bomb reactors in order to combat the Shinra Corporation. This huge corporation is using up Mako energy and draining the life of the planet to power their technology, weapons, and the industrial city of Midgar. One of the bombings goes wrong, and Cloud meets a woman in the slums of Midgar with a mysterious past by the name of Eris. A plot unravels as the Shinra Corporation looks for a promised land to drain more resources from the planet, attempting to hunt down Eris, and another antagonist, Sephiroth, has his own plans for the promised land too. It's up to Cloud, Barrett, Tifa, Cloud's childhood friend, and Eris, and other comrades they meet along the way to stop both entities from reaching the promised land and destroying the planet. At the beginning of the game, Final Fantasy VII feels less like a fantasy and more like a Philip K. Dick novel. However, this game retains the elements of fantasy, like the ability to use magic powers such as lightning, fire, and ice. This gets into the mechanics of the game. The way the player is able to use these magic powers is by equipping materia, which are weapons/attire accessories. There is also the use of summons, elemental beings that the player can summon to strike a huge blow to the enemies. So, Final Fantasy VII blends fantasy and sci-fi elements to create a unique universe for its complex story.
The level of science fantasy elements in Final Fantasy VII is, I think, one of the things which immediately set it apart as something new upon release. Midgar, that dirty metropolis with its slums and reactors and Shinra over it all, really dominates the impression you get from the game the first time you play it. When I first played 7 back in '97, I thought Midgar was the whole game, and that thought alone was entrancing. I mean, you don't start playing in front of a castle or in a forested glade. You start as eco-terrorists in a post-industrial dystopia, not unlike the depths of Lang's Metropolis or Scott's Blade Runner. Midgar is every sweltering, grimy urban disaster from 80s crime and sci-fi movies. Instead of dragons to fight and princesses to rescue, there are technological nightmares, questions of scientific ethics, genetic experiments, a private corporation wielding incredible social and political power, civil unrest, and extreme poverty. These take us closer to the real world, and that's just in the game's first few hours. People really gravitated towards that in its time.
It's these science fiction elements that caught my attention. I've never played a Final Fantasy game, but I've always wanted to get into them. Final Fantasy VII was the first for a lot of people, like the well-read mage mentioned earlier, and it was the first for me. I lean more heavily towards science fiction than fantasy, so that's why I decided on this one. The world of Final Fantasy VII is one that seems as though they took the same medieval world of the past games and set them a few centuries later. Although Midgar is a bustling cyberpunk city, much of the overworld the player traverses is green grass and mountainous regions surrounded by ocean. The player visits different cities and territories where they meet a cast of characters that the player can have in their party, in the usual JRPG fashion. The characters are distinct, having their own weapons and abilities. The characters also have their own backstories, troubles, and reasons for saving the world.
The characters, designed by Tetsuya Nomura, really stay with you after playing the game, significantly if you played it before they became as iconic as they are now. As my colleague mentioned, they each have their moments to shine and bring out the nuances of their personalities, their weaknesses. We get to see plenty of scenes of their past and come to really understand their motivations through their backstories. Director Yoshinori Kitase said, "There wasn't really much controversy or criticism about having Cloud as the hero from Within Square, but he is definitely a mysterious character. That's one of the game's main themes. The fact that the protagonist has all these secrets to unravel. He isn't a straightforward hero like Superman. Rather, he has lots of mysteries, self-doubts, and a real dark side." Cloud Strife was a new kind of hero for the Final Fantasy franchise, a reluctant and occasionally indifferent one with an attitude. Compared to Cecil, Bartz, and Terra, Cloud is much more confused about his role in the world and even his own identity. He seems to suffer more from his darkness and delusion, rather than resist it for most of the game. He's very much a modern character in that sense of being much more broken. Sometimes he comes off as a real jerk, arrogant, cocky, cold, very much a sphincter of a human being, though we come to realize he has a tortured and distorted past. Doesn't actually excuse his constant "not interested" motto, though. Cloud has a distinct personality, so he's not a window character like a stand-in for the player in the world, so an emphasis was placed on developing empathy in the character for him over time. Cloud is the classic fighter class, and he was one of the 3 characters Nomura first created for this game, alongside Eris and Barret. From the beginning, Cloud was to be the hero and main character, contrary to the ensemble cast approach in the previous Final Fantasy VI. The details came later. Cloud is first introduced as an ex-member of Soldier, Shinra's private military force, though he's turned to mercenary work for money, not for the ideals of Avalanche. Cloud seems to be someone who is actively denying who he really was for a variety of reasons, but we eventually discover that the unsociable bravado is a facade. The truth is, Cloud was once an angry child without any real friends except for Tifa, who grew up as his literal girl next door. Cloud eventually left his hometown just to join Soldier, idolizing the legendary warrior Sephiroth. What Cloud forgot about his past is that he never became a member of Soldier, and his relation to Sephiroth and Mako energy is sinister. Trauma that Cloud experiences when he returns to his hometown alongside Sephiroth leads him to becoming a failed science experiment, delirious and vegetative, until he creates a new false persona for himself based off of Tifa's memories and Zack's identity, the man who helped save his life before the events of the game. Cloud's background is very complicated, and the way in which it's revealed through the game makes it both confusing and intriguing. But as the game progresses and Cloud begins to realize who he really is, he sheds the cold exterior for a man who eventually proclaims that he cares for others. Cloud's name probably refers to his moodiness throughout the game as clouds darken the sky, a trope many future Final Fantasy protagonists pick up on. Interestingly enough, the etymology for the word cloud stems from the Old English word clod, which means mass of earth or rock, like a hill, from which we get our English word clot. Tifa Lockhart, Cloud's childhood friend and everybody's waifu, is a member of Avalanche and the proprietor of the Seventh Heaven bar in the Midgar slums. She's equally frustrated by and protective of Cloud. It seems that she suspects something has changed about Cloud's personality at the start of the game, so she convinces Cloud to join Avalanche in order to keep an eye on him. She's a faithful friend for the entire game and even helps Cloud to recover his broken mind and identity. Though there are moments in the game and in the community surrounding it when a kind of love triangle is pointed out between Cloud and Tifa and Aeris, I think it's pretty obvious who Cloud's sweetheart is. This old flame with a penchant for monk-class martial arts and bare-fisted fighting. How could she not be his choice? I mean, there are plenty of scenes in the game that suggest they have feelings for each other, but on top of that, she's powerful, independent, idealistic, and attractive, even with those terrible polygon models they used on the field maps. More importantly, her good nature, warm-heartedness, and hopeful optimism, and trouble expressing herself, make her one of the most endearing characters in this game. She does not give up on Cloud or the planet. The concept for Tifa came into development when it was decided that a character would be killed. When Aeris became that character, Tifa was invented as a rival for Aeris for Cloud's heart, really something different for Final Fantasy games that were very much straightforward before this point. Though she was an invention of necessity for the sake of the story and other characters, Final Fantasy VII just wouldn't be the same game without her. Her influences in Cloud's life helped him through his loneliness and darkest moments. Her influence on games also can't be denied, as she became a prototype for later female heroes, just as determined and just as powerful. Tifa's name is suggested to have come from a variety of origins. It may be short for Tiffany, which stems from the Greek theophania, meaning revealing of God. Barrett Wallace is the leader of Avalanche, the eco-terrorist group over Cloud, Tifa, Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge. An abrasive powerhouse with the mouth of a sailor, Barrett has a dark past, evident from the huge gun attached to his arm where his hand used to be. He believes in saving the planet and stopping Shinra at almost any cost, and he does his best to raise his adopted daughter, Marlene, but he begins the game by really butting heads with Cloud. Cloud's a butthole, so you can't blame him, but Barrett distrusts him, and that distrust often leads to Barrett lashing out. Eventually, however, Barrett begins to demonstrate that he has a good heart. Barrett is retroactively classified as the Gunner class, and he is the first black playable character in the Final Fantasy franchise. He's also a character of paradoxes. He wants to make the world a better place, but he eventually admits he's not the best equipped leader for the job. He has that soft side toward Marlene and his honorable goal of saving the planet, but at the same time he can be remarkably angry and violent, short-tempered and full of rage. This is later explained when we discover that Shinra betrayed him, and that betrayal cost him his village, his family, and his own arm, as well as his friend, Dine. Barret is the perfect character to represent the civil pushback against Shinra, evident from his early inception and development. His backstory barely changed since the character was first invented. Vengeance and anger against Shinra, as well as leading revolution for the sake of the planet, were tenements of the character from the beginning. Also, Barret in a lot of ways represents growing resentment against industrialization and the way in which technology can overcome humanity. Out of all the playable characters, Barret is part mechanical, and his life is defined by mercilessness, balanced out by his buried but tender humanity. Barret, with 2 T's, has a Gaelic origin meaning warlike people. Eris Gainsborough is first encountered by Cloud in Midgar, and she appears to be a plain, pretty flower girl. However, she is yet another mysterious person, and there is much more to Eris than meets the eye. The humble girl represents the last survivor of an ancient race called the Cetra. The Cetra were a spiritual people attuned to the planet, and these ancients are of interest to Shinra, who comes to believe that Eris is the key to finding the fabled Promised Land flowing with Mako and honey. Eris is a character with very little darkness to her. She's cheerful and upbeat, occasionally flirtatious with Cloud, though she has expressed feeling lonely growing up due to her being the last of her kind. Compared with Tifa, Eris doesn't seem to have anything to hide or any difficulty in expressing what's on her mind and heart. She's very open, and she dreams of one day flying on an airship. Most famously, though it's not unprecedented in this franchise, Eris departs from the party at a certain point in the game in order to stop Sephiroth alone, and this leads to her tragic death at the hands of the villain. The permanency of her death and its unexpectedness was a massive element in this game's storytelling and general impact. I remember feeling at the very least a lump in my throat at the emotional, gentle, regretful, but hopeful moment. It's now the equivalent of a
"No, I am your father"
Darth Vader moment in pop culture. Even people who haven't played this game know that Eris dies. However, her personhood lives on in the livestream, and she continues to help Cloud and their friends. Her death plays a part in Seven's themes of life. Nomura said, "We knew even in the early concept stage that one character would have to die. But we only had 3 to choose from. I mean, Cloud's the main character, so you can't really kill him. And Barret, well, maybe that's too obvious. But we had to pick between Aerith and Barret. We debated this for a long time, but in the end decided to sacrifice Aerith." In the previous Final Fantasy games, it became almost a signature theme for one character to sacrifice him or herself, and often it was a similar character type from game to game, kind of a brave, last man standing Barret type character. So everyone expected that. And I think that death should be something sudden and unexpected, and Aerith's death seemed more natural and realistic. Now when I reflect on Final Fantasy VII, the fact that fans were so offended by her sudden death probably means that we were successful with her character. If fans had simply accepted her death, that would have meant she wasn't an effective character. An obvious white mage healer class character, though early plans for the game had her pegged as a geomancer, Eris' name may derive from the Greek Aerios, meaning high in the air, perhaps hinting at her death and spiritual consciousness, though the developers have noted the similarity between Aerith and Earth, which evokes her connection to nature. In Hebrew, there's a girl's name, Aerith, which means flower. In case you're wondering, the different names Aerith and Eris stemmed from translation issues. The original English translation was Eris, but her name has been retconned since Kingdom Hearts as Aerith. I, however, prefer Eris over Aerith, so I don't sound like Mike Tyson. Red 13 is first discovered by the party abused as a science experiment in the Shinra building, and they set him free so he can join in their fight. Red 13 resembles both a dog and a cat, the member of an unnamed species. He's no animal though, and there's a marked intelligence and regality to Red 13, and he can even talk. He comes from Cosmo Canyon, a place with vague Native American connections, and he is a disciple of someone who knows much about the state of the planet. Red's true name is Nanaki, while Red 13 was merely his specimen designation. As one of the game's few non-human playable characters, Red 13 is unique. He was the fourth character created by Nomura, and his name came from a desire to come up with something different. While Red 13 doesn't sound like a name, Nanaki was chosen by the developers because it sounded vaguely Native American. Implementing a four-legged character into the game was difficult as well, but I felt it paid off to create a more diverse cast of characters. Also, his unique connection to the planet and its past helps to flesh out the world even more, as well as provide an interesting, much more fantasy-esque foil for the industrialism throughout the game. Sid Highwind joins the party later in the game. He's an airship pilot and one-time astronaut candidate. He dreamed of going to space and was part of a rocket program, but the countdown of his maiden voyage to the stars had to be cancelled at the very last moment when it was discovered that his assistant, Shara, was in the bottom of the rocket ensuring safety for the launch. Sid blamed Shara for what happened and takes every chance he can to verbally abuse her. It isn't until much later that he's able to forgive her when it's discovered that her safety concerns were very much valid. Sid has a worse mouth than Barrett and is constantly swearing. His fuse seems pretty short. He spits out more Grolixes than anyone else in the game. I was actually pretty surprised by how much swearing there was in Final Fantasy VII the first time I played it. I was used to reading character dialogue aloud with my own voices, so that presented an immediate problem for 12-year-old me. Sid is a recurring name in the Final Fantasy franchise for some reason. His last name, Highwind, is also the name of the airship he designed, and a name which harkens back to the Dragoon class characters, like Ricard Highwind and Kane Highwind, which explains his Final Fantasy Dragoon class use of spears and emphasis on flight. The Sids in Final Fantasy games are typically older, so at least he fits into that category as well. Yuffie Kisaragi is one of two optional characters in the game. She's gained through a side quest thread and isn't necessary for completing the story. Combining the typical Final Fantasy thief and ninja classes, Yuffie is a rebellious tomboy who claims to be a great ninja and a materia hunter, though that just means she steals other people's materia. Her actual aspirations are more noble, though she's perhaps a little naive in accomplishing them. She wishes to restore the glory of her homeland, Wutai, through the powers of materia. A side quest will take you there to fill out her backstory. Yuffie is the youngest member of the party, and it's hard to ever take her seriously. She's bubbly but often rash and impulsive, picking fights easily, and generally she takes stands against any and all forms of tradition. Her surname stems from the Japanese word for February, and Yuffie apparently comes from an actual Japanese name. The Great Ninja ended up as an optional character due to being cut from the game for the sake of a lack of time. The other character who ended up with such a fate is Vincent. You thought Cloud was mysterious. Vincent Valentine is a former member of the Turks with a dark and convoluted background involved with Sephiroth's origins. Brooding and considered cold by the other party members, Vincent is tortured by his past and speaks of his sins he cannot atone for. He's the polar opposite of Yuffie, slow to speak, secretive, wise in weariness, and essentially a lot like Cloud if the spiky-haired hero had been consumed by his past years down the road without recovery. In that sense, Vincent's personality is like a cautionary sign for Cloud. In his past, Vincent was a Turk for Shinra, and he fell in love with a researcher by the name of Lucrezia. But she became involved with Professor Hojo instead, a warped scientist who impregnated her and planned to use the unborn child for experimentation in the Genova project. Pretty sick. This child became Sephiroth. When Vincent found out what Hojo had done, he confronted the scientist but was injured. Hojo then performed further experiments on Vincent's body, trapping him in a vampiric state between life and death. Believing that he failed to protect Lucrezia, Vincent slept as an immortal in the Shinra mansion basement, reliving his nightmares again and again. Vincent occupies the category of the silent warrior and a mysterious past, similar to characters like Auron from Final Fantasy X. His name and surname mean victorious and hail, though he's coincidentally neither of those things. He also has an entire game in which he's the main character, Dirge of Cerberus, a third-person shooter. Vincent is a fan favorite for his cool exterior and dark history. The last playable character to talk about seems to be everyone's least favorite, Cait Sith. No, he doesn't fight the Jedi, he's an animatronic cat, riding on a giant toy, shaped like a fat Moogle, which he magically brought to life. Oh, and his weapon is a megaphone. Oh, and he's a fortune teller. Oh, and also for some reason he has this Scottish accent in future spin-offs. Oh, and he's being operated remotely by a member of Shinra's management, a man named Reeves, whose original motivation was to sabotage Cloud's quest, though he eventually decides to help the team to save the planet and stop Sephiroth. Weird. Cait Sith is actually my favorite character in the whole game. I was surprised, not really, by Black humor when he mentioned he never used the character in his party. I guess Cait Sith is too dopey, but at the time I really loved that he was a robot and a non-human character. I also found his personality and motivations interesting, but he's representative of the wackier side of Final Fantasy VII. I always interpreted Cait Sith as a kind of split personality from Reeves, who is controlling him. Empathetic, Reeves is reserved and proper, but Cait Sith can be boisterous, cowardly, and assertive. Cait Sith begins following Cloud, forcing himself into the party at Gold Saucer, under the pretense that he wanted to see what the fortune he told Cloud meant. Nobody seems to remember that Cait Sith dies in this game too. Yeah, remember that? I cried so hard I didn't stop for hours, and I couldn't leave my room for weeks afterwards. The feels! Cait Sith broke me. That is until his replacement, another robot, arrives to take his place, like a second later. Cait Sith is actually a recurring name in the Final Fantasy series. There are other instances in other games where Cait Sith is an enemy monster that can be fought. His name means fairy cat in Celtic myth, a ghost that haunts Scotland. Bizarre, but that explains the accent in Advent Children, if not the dice and the slots.
As you can tell, Final Fantasy VII is a huge game with an impeccable cast of characters. There's a lot of story and side quests to keep you busy. It's an essential game with a legendary status, and I had the privilege of playing it 20 years later. I'm only 2 years older than this game, so I have no nostalgic connection to it. I've only had the words and praises of other players, and because of its legendary status, it's a game I've always wanted to play. I wish I hadn't waited so long, but I'm glad I was able to play it at all. I'm especially glad I was able to play it on the PlayStation 3. This version and its soundtrack are identical to the one on the first PlayStation, and the controllers are essentially the same too. This game is a must-play for anyone who wants to play landmark games, yet it's still an amazing game in general. If you like games with good stories, then consider Final Fantasy VII, one of the greatest video game stories ever told. I've played other JRPGs before, but I've never been gripped by one as much as this.
Right, there's just such a unique impact to this game. Language like "it's still amazing" is revelatory, I think, of the assumption that video games as a form of art and consumable media have a shelf life which determines their quality, or worse, subtly undermines their historical value, though I don't presume my black colleague believes this. We don't necessarily extend that to other art forms, paintings, poetry, plays, and cinema, do we? When video games age well, it's indicative not merely of their graphics holding up, but of their importance as vehicles through which resonating stories can be told. That's a huge explanation for why Final Fantasy VII has so much lasting appeal. It's also proof positive that the resonance in video games can stand the test of time, 20 years of time. They can remain powerful, moving, sorrowful, cheering, and frightening even after all those years, and I expect that Final Fantasy VII shall remain such throughout the generations. It seems as if gaming's history is broken down into multiple eras defined by milestone games. Final Fantasy VII has engaged gamers of all ages for 2 decades now. I remember when it hit the US shores, it exploded. It was the first game I became aware of that had developed an entire lore out of the rumor mills. Glitches, secrets, hidden abilities, and materia and story threads abounded when this game was released. The internet was just starting to spread into people's homes, and I had my first computer around that time. And with that came all sorts of bits of misinformation. On top of that, there was still all the schoolyard talk. I remember that people said you could breed a white chocobo that could swim underwater and fight the emerald weapon. Others said there were stronger summons in the game than Knights of the Round, but you had to play the game without using materia to find them in the actual geographical promised land. Another one said you could obtain the holy materia and use it to revive Eris. Of course, the biggest rumors involved reviving Eris. As proof, people always pointed to the fact that she has a final limit break built into the game. I actually found an extremely outdated Angel Fire website from around the time, and it has a hilarious Aerith resurrection step-by-step process. None of it worked, of course, and none of it amounted to actual fact, but it was all indicative of the power that Final Fantasy VII had to capture the imagination. 7 is a milestone which must be played. It influenced so many games to come in its wake. Gaming hasn't been the same since.